The dust swirled through the main street of Redemption Springs like restless spirits, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that tasted of iron and desperation. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform erected in front of the county courthouse, where a crowd had gathered for an event that drew both curiosity and contempt in equal measure. Among the assembled faces, weathered ranchers, hard-eyed merchants, and women clutching parasols against the relentless heat, stood Eleanor Whitmore, her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the faded colors of the frontier town. She had come to town for supplies, not expecting to witness what the hand-painted sign proclaimed as a labor auction, a practice that had become disturbingly common in these parts since the railroad pushed through and the mining operations expanded. Her gloved hands clutched a leather purse containing the modest savings from her late husband's estate, money she had intended to use for seed and livestock to keep her small ranch operating through another brutal winter. Before I continue with Eleanor's story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying these tales from the Old West. Please let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers across the country and around the world. The auctioneer, a corpulent man named Cyrus Pemberton, with a voice that carried like thunder across a canyon, stood beside his latest offering, a man who barely resembled one anymore. Chains bound his wrists and ankles, the iron links crusted with rust and something darker that Eleanor didn't want to contemplate. The prisoner stood well over 6 feet tall, his frame massive, even in its current state of deprivation, muscles carved from years of hard labor and harder survival, rippling beneath skin that bore the crisscross patterns of old wounds. His face was a study in controlled fury, high cheekbones and a strong jaw set in an expression that promised violence to anyone foolish enough to come within reach. While his eyes, dark as a moonless night and twice as dangerous, swept across the crowd with a mixture of contempt and resignation. The crowd called him the Apache, though Eleanor suspected that name was less about heritage and more about the untamed quality that radiated from him like heat from desert stone. "Now here's a fine specimen of manpower, ladies and gentlemen," Pemberton bellowed, his jowls shaking with enthusiasm as he gestured toward the chained man with his walking stick. "Strong as an ox, mean as a rattler, but perfectly suited for the heaviest labor your operations require. He's got 5 years of debt to work off, 5 years of guaranteed service to whoever's got the capital to invest in quality muscle." The auctioneer circled his merchandise like a rancher appraising livestock, occasionally prodding the prisoner's shoulder or arm to demonstrate the solid mass beneath. Caught him working the silver mines up near Tombstone, got himself into debt with some gambling and whiskey, as these types do. Judge Robertson sentenced him to indentured servitude until the debt's paid, nice and legal-like. The prisoner's jaw tightened at this recitation of his supposed crimes, and Eleanor noticed his hands clench into fists despite the chains, the tendons in his forearms standing out like cables beneath scarred skin. Eleanor felt her stomach turn as the bidding began, watching respectable businessmen and ranch owners raise their hands to claim ownership of another human being, even if the law dressed it up in different words than the slavery that had torn the nation apart just years before. She had heard of these arrangements, men accused of crimes or debts they often hadn't committed, sentenced to years of brutal labor that frequently killed them before their terms expired. The practice exploited loopholes in the new constitutional amendments, finding ways to bind men through debt and legal maneuvering, rather than outright ownership. Her late husband Thomas had spoken against such things before his death 6 months prior, calling them a stain on the territory that aspired to statehood. Now, standing in the crowd, with the sun beating down on her black hat and the dust coating her throat, Eleanor found herself unable to look away from the man on the platform, particularly from the network of scars that decorated his torso, some old and silvered, others relatively fresh and still angry red. "Do I hear 300? Pemberton called out, his voice rising with the excitement of a successful sale. A cattle baron named Hutchinson, known throughout the territory for working his laborers until they dropped, raised his hand with a cruel smile. 350 from the gentleman in the back. Anyone willing to go 400 for 5 years of prime labor?" The bidding climbed steadily, and with each increment, Eleanor saw something in the prisoner's eyes shift. Not hope, because hope had clearly been beaten out of him long ago, but a deepening acceptance of whatever fresh hell awaited him. She thought of her own situation, a widow, alone on a struggling ranch, with more work than 10 people could manage, facing another winter that might break her entirely. But more than that, she thought of the sermon she had heard just last Sunday about human dignity and the responsibility of those with means to show mercy to those without. The prisoner's eyes swept across the crowd again, and for just a moment, his gaze locked with Eleanor's. In that instant, she saw past the savage exterior to something else, a flicker of intelligence, of awareness, of a soul that hadn't been entirely crushed by whatever circumstances had brought him to this platform. The connection lasted only a heartbeat before he looked away, his expression hardening once more into that mask of controlled violence. But that single moment of contact ignited something in Eleanor's chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but recognized as dangerous, a pull towards something she should absolutely avoid, a fascination with the very wildness that should repel a respectable widow. She had always been the practical one, the sensible daughter who married the steady rancher rather than the charming drifter, the woman who kept precise accounts and never acted on impulse. $500. Hutchinson's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "And I'll work every penny out of his hide. You can be certain of that." Laughter rippled through the crowd at this pronouncement, cruel amusement at the prisoner's expense. The chained man's face remained impassive, but Eleanor saw his shoulders tense, saw the way his breathing changed, shallow and controlled, like a predator preparing to strike, even knowing the chains made it impossible. Pemberton raised his gavel, preparing to seal the deal. 500 going once, going twice. The words seemed to move through thick honey, everything slowing down as Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. $600. The words burst from Eleanor's lips before her rational mind could stop them, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. Every head turned to stare at her, shock written across their faces. A respectable widow, a woman alone, bidding on a male prisoner known for his violence and intractability. She felt her cheeks burn with a flush that had nothing to do with the desert heat. But she kept her chin raised and her eyes steady on Pemberton, refusing to show the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. What was she doing? That money represented her security, her survival through the coming winter. But she wouldn't, let Hutchinson take this man to be worked to death in some remote camp, where his bones would eventually bleach in the sun, alongside countless others. The prisoner's head snapped toward her, those dark eyes fixing on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Hutchinson's face purpled with rage, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip before he seemed to remember where he was. "Now see here, Mrs. Whitmore, you can't possibly—" His objection was cut short by Pemberton's raised hand. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with greed as he calculated the unexpected windfall. "The lady has made a legal bid. Do I hear $650?" The silence stretched out, broken only by the whisper of wind through the street and the distant sound of a piano from one of the saloons. Hutchinson glared at Eleanor with undisguised hostility, but he shook his head sharply and stalked away from the platform. "Going once, going twice. Sold to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore for $600. The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, sealing Eleanor's fate to the chained stranger, whose eyes had never left her face, whose expression had shifted from surprise to something more complex, suspicion mixed with the faintest hint of curiosity. As the crowd dispersed, muttering about foolish widows and wasted money, Eleanor approached the platform with legs that felt distinctly unsteady. Up close, the man was even more imposing, towering over her 5'4" frame by more than a foot, his presence filling the space around him like a physical force. The scars she had noticed from a distance were even more pronounced now, evidence of knife fights, bullet wounds, and what looked like marks from a whip across his back. Pemberton handed her the papers that legally bound this man to her service for the next 5 years, his expression a mixture of amusement and disdain. "You sure about this, Mrs. Whitmore? This one's got a reputation. Killed 2 men up in the mining camps. Self-defense, supposedly. But he's dangerous. Name's registered as John Hawk, though I doubt that's what his mama called him." The prisoner, John Hawk, said nothing, but she felt the weight of his stare like a brand against her skin. Eleanor signed the papers with a steady hand, despite her inner turmoil, counted out the $600 in bills and coins that represented months of careful saving, and accepted the key to the chains. "Where are you from, Mr. Hawk?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm as she approached him. He didn't answer immediately, studying her with those penetrating eyes as if trying to divine her motivations. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, but deeper than she'd expected, with an educated quality that surprised her. "Nowhere that matters anymore, ma'am, and everywhere that led me here." His response was cryptic, but somehow fitting for a man who clearly guarded his past as carefully as a miser guards gold. She could smell the sweat and grime of his captivity, see the raw wounds where the shackles had rubbed his wrists bloody, and felt a surge of anger at the system that had reduced a human being to this state. "I'm taking you to my ranch, the Whitmore property about 5 miles south of here," Eleanor said, keeping her voice low enough that curious onlookers couldn't hear. "You'll work for me, but you'll be treated fairly. I need help keeping the place running, and in return, you'll have decent food, a clean place to sleep, and no one will beat you or work you beyond human endurance." She paused, then added with more conviction than she felt, "And if you try to run or cause trouble, the law will be on you faster than a hawk on a rabbit. Do we understand each other?" John Hawk's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile, though it held no humor. "Yes, ma'am, I understand perfectly. You bought yourself a work animal, and you're making sure I know the rules of the pasture." His words stung, partly because they contained an uncomfortable truth about what she had just done, however noble her intentions might have been. Eleanor unlocked the chains around his ankles first, the iron falling away to reveal raw, infected skin that made her wince. When she moved to his wrists, she noticed his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from what she recognized as controlled fury. "I didn't buy an animal, Mr. Hawk," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "I bought you out of a worse situation. What you make of that is up to you." She unlocked the wrist shackles, and for a moment, they stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the slight widening of his pupils as he looked down at her. Free of the chains, he could easily overpower her, could snap her neck before anyone could intervene. They both knew it. But he simply rubbed his wrists, leaving smears of blood on his callous palms, and took a step back. "Thank you for the chains, Mrs. Whitmore. Where's this ranch of yours?" His tone was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. The ride back to the Whitmore ranch in Eleanor's wagon was conducted in silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady clop of her horse's hooves on the packed dirt road. John Hawk sat in the back, his large frame taking up most of the wagon bed, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon with the wariness of a man accustomed to expecting trouble from every direction. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of his presence behind her, felt the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. What had possessed her to spend her savings on a complete stranger? What would people say when word spread, and it would spread, quickly, that the Whitmore widow had brought a convicted laborer to her isolated ranch? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Eleanor's mind hadn't been churning with doubts and second thoughts. The Whitmore Ranch appeared on the horizon like a promise of shelter after the tension of town. A modest house with a covered porch, a barn that needed repairs, corrals that held only a few cattle and horses when they should have been bursting with livestock, and fields that showed the struggle of one person trying to maintain what had been built by two. Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment at bringing someone to witness the evidence of her failure to thrive alone. Thomas had been the visionary, the one who saw potential in this land. She had been the support, the one who kept the household running while he built their dream. Without him, the dream was slowly crumbling, surrendering to the unforgiving nature of the frontier. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the barn, setting the brake with hands that had developed calluses from work no lady in proper society would consider appropriate. "This is home," Eleanor said simply, climbing down from the wagon seat with practiced ease. John Hawk followed, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man, landing lightly on his feet despite the obvious pain from his injuries. He surveyed the property with those assessing eyes, no doubt calculating escape routes and evaluating whether his new situation was any improvement over the auction block. "The bunkhouse is there," Eleanor pointed to a small structure near the barn, "though it's been empty since my husband passed, and our hands moved on to better prospects. There's a bed, a stove, and I'll bring you blankets and supplies. You'll start work tomorrow, after you've had a chance to rest, and I've treated those wounds." She was already moving toward the house, her mind cataloging the medical supplies she had on hand. Whiskey for disinfecting, clean cloth for bandages, salve for the raw skin. Why? The single word stopped Eleanor in her tracks. She turned to find John Hawke watching her with an expression that was part suspicion, part genuine confusion. "Why what?" she asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "Why bid on me? Why bring me here? Why treat me like I'm something more than the criminal the law says I am?" He took a step closer, and Eleanor fought the urge to step back, to retreat from the intensity of his presence. "Women like you don't do things like this without a reason. So what is it? You need a man around for protection, for companionship? What exactly am I to you, Mrs. Whitmore?" His questions held an edge of bitterness, the cynicism of someone who had learned to expect the worst from people and was rarely disappointed. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen at the implications in his questions, felt anger rising to combat the flutter of nerves his proximity caused. "You're here to work, Mr. Hawke, nothing more and nothing less. As for why I bid on you—" She paused, searching for words to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "I watched the way Hutchinson looked at you, like you were already dead, and he was just waiting to use up your corpse. I watched the crowd laugh at your situation, at your suffering, and I wouldn't be part of that. Call it conscience, call it foolishness, but I will not stand by while another human being is destroyed for profit and entertainment." Her voice had risen despite her intention to remain calm, passion bleeding through the carefully maintained composure she wore like armor. Something flickered in John Hawke's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. The hard edge of suspicion didn't disappear entirely, but it softened fractionally. "Conscience," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's a luxury, Mrs. Whitmore. Expensive one, too. $600 worth of conscience." He rubbed his wrists again, a gesture she suspected would become habitual, then surprised her by extending his hand. "I'll work off the debt honestly. You have my word on that. Whatever that's worth from a man in my position." His hand was massive, calloused, and marked with more scars. But when Eleanor placed her smaller hand in his grip was careful, controlled, the handshake of someone who knew his own strength and chose to restrain it. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through Eleanor's system, a physical awareness that she immediately tried to suppress. This was her employee, her indentured laborer, a man she had purchased out of a situation that offended her moral sensibilities. Nothing more. She withdrew her hand quickly, perhaps too quickly, and gestured toward the bunkhouse. "Get yourself settled. I'll bring water for washing and medical supplies. There's a well pump behind the barn if you need more water. I'll prepare a meal and bring it out to you shortly." She was already turning away, needing distance to collect herself, when his voice stopped her again. "Mrs. Whitmore?" She looked back over her shoulder. "Thank you. I don't say that often, and I don't say it lightly. But thank you for not being Hutchinson." The simple sincerity in his words was more disarming than any amount of charm could have been. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice, and walked toward the house with measured steps that wanted to break into either a run or a collapse. She wasn't sure which. Inside, she leaned against the closed door and took several deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. What had she done? She had brought a dangerous, violent man, a convicted criminal, to her isolated ranch, where she lived alone with no protection beyond her late husband's rifle and her own wits. The sensible part of her brain screamed that she had made a terrible mistake, that she should send word to town for the marshal to come collect John Hawk immediately. But another part, a part she hadn't known existed until today, remembered the moment their eyes had met on that auction platform. Remembered the intelligence and awareness she had seen beneath the savage exterior. That part whispered that she had done exactly what she needed to do, though it couldn't explain why. She moved through the evening routine mechanically, heating water on the stove, gathering clean cloth and medical supplies, preparing a substantial meal of beef stew and fresh bread. The work steadied her, gave her hands and mind something concrete to focus on, rather than the maelstrom of conflicting emotions churning in her chest. Through the kitchen window, she could see the bunkhouse, could see lamplight flickering to life as John Hawk apparently found and lit the lantern she kept there. The sight of that light, evidence of another human presence on the property after 6 months of solitude, stirred something in Eleanor that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. She had been so lonely, she realized, not just for company, but for purpose, for someone to care for a reason to wake up each morning beyond mere stubborn survival. When Eleanor carried the supplies and food to the bunkhouse, she knocked on the doorframe, despite having every legal right to simply enter. "Mr. Hawk, I've brought what I promised." The door opened, and she found him shirtless, attempting to wash at the small basin with water from the pump. The lamplight cast shadows across the landscape of his torso, highlighting every ridge of muscle and valley of scar tissue. Eleanor felt her breath catch, not from fear, but from a visceral reaction she had no right to feel. He reached for his shirt, and she found her voice. "Don't. I need to treat those wounds, and you putting that filthy shirt back on would defeat the purpose." She set the supplies on the small table and gestured to the single chair. "Sit down, please. This will sting." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, falling into the role of caretaker with relief. John Hawk sat as instructed, his expression unreadable as Eleanor approached with cloth soaked in whiskey. She started with his wrists, cleaning away the dried blood and grime, to reveal the full extent of the damage. Deep abrasions where the shackles had eaten into his skin, signs of infection starting to take hold. He didn't flinch as she worked, even when she knew the alcohol must have burned like fire. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I've tended my own wounds before." Eleanor didn't look up from her work, focusing on being thorough. "I'm sure you have, but you're on my property now, and I'll not have you dying of infection because pride kept you from accepting help." She moved to his other wrist, her fingers gentle, despite the clinical nature of the task. "These chains were medieval. Whoever put them on you should be horsewhipped themselves." The words came out more vehement than she intended, revealing the depth of her anger at his treatment. "Welcome to justice, frontier style," John Hawk said with dark humor. "The law isn't always just, Mrs. Whitmore. Sometimes it's just legal." Eleanor paused in her work, meeting his eyes. "What really happened? What landed you in those chains?" She saw him weigh the question, decide whether to answer honestly or give her a convenient lie. "I worked in the silver mines up near Tombstone. Decent work, decent pay. Some men took exception to an Apache. That's what they called me. Even though I've got as much Scotch-Irish blood as anything else, working alongside white men. They started a fight, and I finished it. Problem was, they had friends in high places, and I didn't. One man died. Another lost the use of his arm. Self-defense doesn't matter much when the judge is drinking buddies with the victim's employer. His jaw tightened. They couldn't legally hang me, so they did the next best thing. Sentenced me to indentured servitude until I paid my debt to society. The bitterness in his voice was palpable, justified by circumstances Eleanor couldn't even imagine. Eleanor absorbed this information as she continued her ministrations, moving to the wounds on his shoulders and back. Up close, she could see the story his scars told, a life of violence, survival, and endless fighting. Some scars were clean, the kind made by knives in combat. Others were jagged, evidence of accidents or attacks. The whip marks were the worst, old but still visible, speaking to an even darker chapter of his past. "These," she whispered, her fingers hovering just above the raised tissue. "Who did this to you?" John Hawke was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless, in the way of someone recounting facts rather than reliving trauma. "Different people at different times, ma'am. I've worn a few chains in my life, before and after the war. Some scars you collect just by being alive when other people think you shouldn't be." "They laughed at these today," Eleanor said, continuing to clean and treat each wound with careful attention. "The crowd, they saw your scars and laughed, like they were entertainment." She felt a fierce protectiveness rising in her chest, shocking in its intensity, given that she had known this man for mere hours. "I want you to know something, Mr. Hawke. I don't laugh at what you've survived. In fact," she paused, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder blade, feeling the warmth of his skin and the slight tension in his muscles. "I think each of these tells a story of strength, of survival, against circumstances that would have broken lesser men. If I could, I would kiss every one of them, not to erase them, but to honor what they represent. A life that refused to quit, a spirit that wouldn't break." The words tumbled out before she could censor them, revealing far more than she had intended about the strange connection she felt to this scarred stranger. The silence that followed her declaration was heavy, charged with something Eleanor couldn't name, but felt in every fiber of her being. John Hawke's shoulders had gone rigid under her touch, and she could see the side of his face, see the muscles in his jaw working as he processed what she had said. Finally, he turned his head to look at her over his shoulder, and the intensity in his dark eyes made her breath catch. "You're a dangerous woman, Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, his voice rough with some emotion she couldn't identify. "More dangerous than you know, saying things like that to a man like me." There was a warning in his words, but also something else, a recognition, perhaps, of the strange current that seemed to flow between them, bridging the vast divide of their different worlds. Eleanor stepped back, breaking the contact, her hands suddenly shaking as the reality of what she had said, what she had revealed, crashed over her. "I apologize. That was inappropriate. I don't know what possessed me to." She turned away, busying herself with packing up the medical supplies, needing to escape the intensity of his gaze and her own confusing emotions. "The food is there on the table. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll discuss the work that needs doing." She was moving toward the door, fleeing, when his voice stopped her one last time. "Eleanor, not Mrs. Whitmore, but her given name," spoken in that deep voice with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a harsh exterior. She froze, hand on the doorframe, but didn't turn around. "Thank you, for the care and for the words. Both mean more than you could possibly know." She nodded once, not trusting her voice, and stepped out into the cooling night air, leaving John Hawk alone in the lamplight. The walk back to the house felt longer than it should have. Each step weighted with the knowledge that her life had fundamentally changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. Eleanor lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she had shared with Thomas, trying to reconcile the sensible widow she had always been with the woman who had just spent $600 on a violent stranger and then confessed to wanting to kiss his scars. What madness had possessed her? The attraction she felt, and she could no longer deny it was attraction, was dangerous, foolish, and completely inappropriate given their circumstances. He was her indentured laborer, legally bound to her service, which meant any relationship beyond employer and employee would be not only socially unacceptable, but also ethically compromised. Yet even as these rational thoughts cycled through her mind, she found herself wondering what stories those scars could tell, what kind of strength it had taken to survive whatever had carved them into his flesh. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect autumn day that made the harshness of the frontier seem almost manageable. Eleanor rose early, as was her habit, and prepared breakfast while trying to organize her thoughts and re-establish the proper boundaries that had slipped so dangerously the night before. John Hawk was her employee, nothing more. She would treat him fairly, work him reasonably, and maintain the professional distance appropriate to their arrangement. By the time she carried breakfast to the bunkhouse, plates of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits along with strong coffee, she had convinced herself she could manage her wayward emotions through sheer force of will. The knock on the door was answered quickly, and she found John Hawk already awake, dressed in clean clothes he must have washed and dried overnight, his damp hair pulled back from his face. The morning light, streaming through the window, made his features less harsh, revealed the intelligence in his eyes that she had glimpsed on the auction platform. "Good morning, Mr. Hawk," Eleanor said, with determined cheerfulness, setting the plates on the table. "I thought we'd have breakfast together, while we discuss the work." She had decided, during her sleepless night, that maintaining normalcy meant not hiding in the house while he ate alone. That would only feed the awareness that crackled between them. If she treated the situation as perfectly ordinary, perhaps it would become so. John Hawk studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could see right through her forced composure to the turmoil beneath. But he simply nodded and sat down, waiting until she was seated before beginning to eat. Manners that spoke to a background that contradicted his current circumstances. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Eleanor began outlining the ranch's needs. The barn needs significant repairs before winter sets in properly, Eleanor explained, grateful to focus on concrete tasks rather than confusing emotions. "Several fence lines need mending, and we need to bring in more hay for the livestock. The cattle need to be moved to the lower pasture, and there's firewood to cut and stack for the winter months. I've been managing alone, but..." She paused, pride warring with honesty. "But I've been failing. The ranch is slowly falling apart because there's simply too much work for one person." Admitting this vulnerability felt strange, but also somehow necessary. John Hawk listened attentively, his eyes moving to the window occasionally to assess the property in the growing daylight. "I can handle most of that. Worked construction before the mines, and I grew up on a cattle operation in Texas before..." He didn't finish that sentence, and Eleanor didn't push. "How many head of cattle you running?" 43 now, Eleanor admitted. "Down from nearly 200 when Thomas was alive. I've had to sell most of them just to keep the property running. This winter will be the test. If I can't build the herd back up by spring, I'll likely lose the ranch entirely." The words hurt to say out loud, making the precarious nature of her situation painfully clear. John Hawk's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Then we'd best get to work. Can't have you losing your home after what you did yesterday." There was no judgment in his voice, only a simple statement of intent that somehow reassured Eleanor more than elaborate promises would have. They finished breakfast in more comfortable silence, and Eleanor found herself stealing glances at his face, studying the angles and planes that made him simultaneously brutal and beautiful in the morning light. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt both natural and strange. John Hawk proved to be not only willing, but highly skilled. His hands showed expertise with wood and tools, with animals and equipment. He worked from sunup to sundown, approaching each task with quiet intensity and visible pride in doing work well. Eleanor found herself looking for excuses to bring water or food to wherever he was working, to check on his progress, to simply be near him. She told herself she was being a responsible employer, ensuring her investment was protected. But she knew, in the honest parts of her mind she tried to ignore, that she was drawn to him in ways that had nothing to do with fence repairs or barn construction. She watched the way his muscles moved under his shirt as he lifted beams, the way sweat dampened his hair in the afternoon heat, the way his hands, gentle despite their size and strength, handled skittish horses and mended delicate tack with equal skill. John Hawk, for his part, maintained a careful distance even as he worked on her property. He was polite, respectful, and utterly professional in their interactions. But Eleanor sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part wariness, part curiosity, and something else that made her pulse quicken. They developed an unspoken dance of avoidance and approach, neither acknowledging the tension that seemed to build with each passing day. Eleanor threw herself into her own work, cooking, cleaning, managing the ranch accounts, tending the garden, anything to distract herself from the constant awareness of his presence. She told herself daily that this attraction was temporary, that familiarity would breed indifference, that her feelings were simply the result of loneliness and proximity. None of these assurances helped. 3 weeks after bringing John Hawk to the ranch, Eleanor woke to find the first snow of the season dusting the ground, autumn surrendering to early winter's grip. She dressed quickly and hurried outside, worried about the cattle and the unfinished repairs. What she found stopped her in her tracks. John Hawk had clearly been working since before dawn, had already moved the cattle to the sheltered lower pasture, and was securing the last of the hay under protective tarps. He worked with efficient precision, anticipating the storm that the morning sky promised. Eleanor felt a swell of gratitude, and something deeper, something that frightened her with its intensity. This man, who owed her nothing but labor to pay a debt he shouldn't have had, was protecting her home as if it were his own. She found herself walking toward him before consciously deciding to move. "You didn't have to do all this alone," Eleanor said when she reached him, her breath puffing white in the cold air. "You should have woken me." John Hawk secured the last rope and turned to face her, snowflakes catching in his dark hair and on his shoulders. "You need your sleep, Mrs. Whitmore, and I don't mind the work." His eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her shiver for reasons unrelated to the cold. "Besides, I've been thinking, about what happens in 5 years when my debt is paid. The change in topic surprised her, and Eleanor felt her heart stutter. 5 years suddenly seemed both impossibly long and frighteningly short. "What about it?" she managed to ask, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. "I could go anywhere then," John Hawke said slowly, as if choosing each word with care. "Head to California, try my luck in the north, disappear into Mexico, or—" He paused, and Eleanor held her breath. "Or I could stay, as a partner, not a laborer, help you build this ranch into what it should be." The offer hung in the cold air between them, loaded with implications and possibilities that terrified and thrilled Eleanor in equal measure. He was proposing a future together, not romance, not explicitly, but a shared enterprise that would bind them together beyond the legal contract that currently held him here. It was practical, sensible even. It was also the most dangerous thing he could have suggested, because it gave form and substance to the connection she had been trying so desperately to deny. "That's 5 years away," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, her usual decisiveness deserting her in the face of this unexpected proposition. "A lot can happen in 5 years. You might change your mind. I might." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate all the ways the future was uncertain. John Hawke took a step closer, close enough that she could see the individual snowflakes melting on his skin, could smell the clean scent of wood smoke and horse that clung to him. "Or we could acknowledge what's been happening since the day you bought me off that platform," he said, his voice low and rough. "This pull between us, this thing neither of us can quite name, but both of us feel." His honesty stunned her into silence, stripped away all her careful pretense. "I know I've got no right to speak of such things. I know the gulf between us, your respectability, my circumstances. But I've never been one for pretty lies, Mrs. Whitmore. Eleanor." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, whether from emotion or the cold wind, she couldn't say. "I feel it too," she admitted, the words wrenched from someplace deep and honest. "God help me, I felt it from the beginning, and I don't know what to do with it. She struggled for words. "You're my employee, bound to me by law and debt. Any relationship beyond that would be—" She couldn't say wrong, because standing here in the snow, looking into his eyes, it didn't feel wrong at all. It felt like the most right thing she'd experienced since Thomas died, which was its own kind of betrayal. "Complicated," she finally finished weakly. "Complicated," John Hawke agreed, a slight smile touching his lips, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "That's one word for it. Here's another truth, Eleanor. I've lived a hard life, made harder choices than most people face in 10 lifetimes. I've killed men who tried to kill me. I've stolen to eat, fought for survival, and worn chains more than once. I'm not a good man by most measures." His hand rose slowly, giving her time to step away. And when she didn't, he gently brushed a snowflake from her cheek, his touch achingly tender. "But I've never felt for another human being what I feel when I look at you. I've never wanted to be better than I am, to deserve something I have no right to want. You make me believe I could be more than what circumstances have made me." The confession broke something loose in Eleanor's chest, all her careful restraint crumbling in the face of such raw honesty. "I'm not looking for you to be anything other than what you are," she said, her hand rising almost of its own accord to rest against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. Those scars I spoke of, they're not flaws to be overcome. They're evidence of survival, of strength, of a spirit that refused to quit. You're not broken, John Hawk. You're the strongest person I've ever met." She realized as she spoke that she meant every word, that somewhere in the past weeks, her fascination had deepened into something far more profound. She wasn't trying to tame him, to domesticate the wildness that made him who he was. She was drawn to it, honored it, wanted to stand beside it rather than break it down. John Hawk's breath caught, his hand covering hers against his chest. "Eleanor," he said, her name a prayer and a question. "What do you want? Not what's proper or expected. What do you want?" The directness of the question demanded an equally direct answer, and Eleanor found herself brave enough to give it. "I want to know you, really know you, your story, your thoughts, your dreams if you have any left. I want to build something with you, whether it's just this ranch or—" She couldn't quite finish, but she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "And I want to stop pretending there's nothing between us when every moment I'm near you, I feel like I'm catching fire." The admission left her breathless and slightly shocked at her own boldness. For a long moment, they stood frozen in the falling snow. The world narrowed to just the two of them, and the recognition passing between them of something that could not be unsaid or taken back. Then John Hawk leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and pressed his lips to her forehead. Not a kiss of passion, but of reverence, of promise. "Then let's stop pretending," he said against her skin. "Let people talk. Let them judge. We'll build something here worth having, the two of us together. And when those 5 years are done, if you'll have me, I'll stay not as your debtor, but as your partner in every sense of the word." He pulled back to meet her eyes. "But we do this right, slowly. I won't take advantage of the power you hold over me, and you won't use what you feel to influence how you treat me. We'll be honest, and we'll be patient, and we'll see where this thing between us leads." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. It was a strange courtship he proposed, conducted under the eyes of a judgmental town, complicated by laws and contracts, stretched across 5 years before they could truly be equals. But standing in the snow with his hand still covering hers, she felt more hope than she had since Thomas died. This wasn't replacing what she'd had. It was something entirely different, dangerous and wild, and utterly her own choice. They stood together for several more heartbeats before the practical realities of ranch life reasserted themselves. "We should get inside," Eleanor said reluctantly. "That storm's getting worse, and we've both got work to do." John Hawk nodded and released her hand, but the look in his eyes promised that this conversation was a beginning, not an ending. The weeks turned into months, and winter settled over the ranch with serious intent. Eleanor and John Hawk worked side by side to keep the property running, their relationship evolving into something neither had anticipated. They talked during the long winter evenings, not in the house, where propriety would be too compromised, but in the barn, while tending animals, or in the kitchen, while Eleanor prepared meals, and John Hawk sat at the table mending tack. He told her stories of his past in carefully measured doses, revealing a life that had been harder than she'd imagined. Born to a Scottish father and a mother of mixed Cherokee and white heritage, he'd never quite belonged anywhere, accepted by neither world. He'd fought in the war as a boy soldier, survived brutal labor camps, drifted through territories, working whatever jobs would have him. Each story added depth to her understanding of the man behind the scars, made her respect his survival and strength even more. Eleanor, in turn, shared her own story, the dutiful daughter who married the kind rancher, who had been content, if not passionate, who had supported her husband's dreams while sublimating her own. She spoke of Thomas with honesty and respect, not diminishing what they'd had, but not romanticizing it either. "I cared for him deeply," she told John one evening, as they stood in the barn, checking on a pregnant mare. "But what I feel when I'm with you," she struggled for words. "It's different, bigger somehow, frightening in its intensity." John Hawk listened without judgment, his presence solid and reassuring. "Love comes in different forms," he said quietly. "What you had with Thomas was real and valid. What's growing between us doesn't diminish that. It's just something else, something new." His wisdom on matters of the heart surprised her until she remembered that survival demanded understanding human nature in all its complexity. The town, predictably, had opinions about the Whitmore widow and her purchased laborer. Eleanor faced cold shoulders at church, heard whispers in the general store, felt the weight of judgment every time she came to town. She held her head high and refused to explain herself to anyone. But the ostracism hurt nonetheless. John Hawk saw it, understood it, and one day made an unexpected suggestion. "You could send me away," he said, while they were working in the tack room. "Find another arrangement for the debt. Your reputation is suffering because of me." Eleanor's hands stilled on the bridle she was cleaning. "Do you want to go?" she asked, her heart in her throat. "Not even a little bit," he admitted. "But I don't want to be the cause of your isolation from your community either." Eleanor set down the bridle and turned to face him fully. "Let me be very clear, John Hawk. I chose this. I chose you. And I would make the same choice again, knowing everything I know now. Their judgment says more about them than it does about us." As spring approached, bringing thaw and the promise of renewal, the ranch began to show the results of their combined efforts. Fences were sound, buildings repaired, and the small herd was thriving. Eleanor purchased more cattle with money carefully saved, planning to expand the operation. John Hawk's expertise with horses led them to consider breeding quality stock as a secondary income source. They worked as a seamless team, each anticipating the other's needs and thoughts with the ease of people who had learned to truly see one another. The physical attraction between them remained, simmering beneath the surface of their daily interactions, but they had honored their promise to move slowly, to build something solid before adding the complexity of physical intimacy. One evening in early April, as they stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, John Hawk broke their comfortable silence. "A year ago, I was in chains on an auction block, believing my life was effectively over," he said quietly. "I had nothing, was nothing, just a body to be used until it wore out. Now," he gestured at the ranch, the land stretching out around them, "now I have purpose, partnership, something worth waking up for every morning. You gave me that, Eleanor. You gave me back my life." His voice roughened with emotion. "I still have 4 years on my contract, but I want you to know, I'm already yours. Not because the law says so, but because I choose to be." Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling in his words. "I'm yours too," she whispered, turning to face him. "I think I have been since the moment you looked at me from that platform, and I saw past the chains to the man beneath." She reached up to touch his face, tracing one of the scars that marked his cheekbone. "I meant what I said that first night. About kissing every scar, about honoring what they represent. You're not what happened to you, John. You're what you chose to become despite it all." John Hawk caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent heat racing through her veins. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice rough with desire and restraint in equal measure. "If we cross this line, there's no going back. People will know. They'll have even more reason to condemn us. Are you sure?" His concern for her reputation, even now, when she could see the want in his eyes, only made her more certain. "I'm sure," Eleanor said, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. "I've never been more sure of anything." Their first kiss was tentative, exploratory. Two people who had waited so long finally allowing themselves to acknowledge the connection that had been building since that first day. But tentative quickly gave way to something more urgent, more passionate, as months of restraint fell away. John Hawk's arms came around her with a care that made her heart ache. Such gentleness from hands that had known so much violence. Eleanor poured everything she felt into that kiss. Acceptance, desire, respect, and the beginnings of something that felt remarkably like love. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, John Hawk rested his forehead against hers. "I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of you," he promised. "I will build this ranch into something extraordinary. I will stand by your side against any challenge, and I will love you with everything I am until my last breath." The vow was more binding than any marriage ceremony could have been, spoken with absolute conviction. The months that followed were not without challenges. Hutchinson, still bitter about losing the auction, tried to cause trouble by questioning the legality of Eleanor's arrangement with John Hawk, hoping to find grounds to reclaim him. The local marshal came to investigate, but Eleanor's papers were in perfect order, and even the marshal, a fair man despite his position, could see that John Hawk was well treated, working in conditions far better than most in his situation. Hutchinson's attempt backfired, costing him respect in the community, while paradoxically improving Eleanor's standing. Apparently, defending your property against a bully earned more approval than moral judgments about improper relationships. Several neighboring ranchers, impressed by the improvements to the Whitmore property, began asking John Hawk's advice on construction and horse breeding, which provided additional income and grudging respect. Eleanor and John Hawk navigated the complexities of their relationship with honesty and patience. They maintained separate living quarters, propriety observed even as their connection deepened, but spent their evenings together, planning, talking, sometimes just existing in comfortable silence. Physical intimacy became part of their relationship, private and precious, a celebration of the bond they had forged. Eleanor discovered that the wildness she had seen in John Hawk wasn't something to be tamed, but something to be honored, matched by a wildness in herself she hadn't known existed. They were equals in passion as they were in partnership, neither dominating nor submitting, but meeting as two whole people choosing to intertwine their lives. 2 years into John Hawk's contract, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor, a lawyer from back east representing a distant relative who claimed ownership of a portion of her land based on a disputed inheritance. The legal challenge threatened everything they had built, and the fees to fight it would bankrupt the ranch. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, buried in papers and despair, when John Hawk found her. He listened to the situation without interruption, then disappeared into the bunkhouse and returned with a locked box she'd never seen before. "I have money," he said simply, opening the box to reveal a substantial sum in gold and bills. "From before, from work I did that was actually compensated fairly. I've been holding on to it, not sure what I was saving it for. Now I know. This ranch, this life, it's worth fighting for. Take what you need." Eleanor stared at the money, then at him. "This is yours. Your security, your freedom when the contract ends." John Hawk shook his head. "My security is here, with you. My freedom is in choosing where I stand and who I stand with. Take it, Eleanor. Let's fight this together." They won the legal battle, though it took months and most of John Hawk's savings, plus additional loans. But they won, and in winning, something shifted. The town watched a man with no legal obligation beyond his labor contract pour his personal resources into defending a woman's property, watched him fight for her in ways that transcended obligation. Public opinion began to shift, not entirely, never entirely, in a place as traditional as Redemption Springs, but enough. The mayor's wife began nodding to Eleanor at church. The bank manager complimented their joint business acumen. Slowly, grudgingly, the community began to accept that the Whitmore widow and her laborer were a permanent fixture, a partnership that worked against all expectation. 3 years into the contract, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when Eleanor had first brought him home, John Hawk asked her to take a walk with him to the high pasture. They climbed the hill in companionable silence, and at the top, overlooking the ranch that had become their shared dream, he turned to her with unusual nervousness. "I've been thinking," he began, and Eleanor smiled at the familiar opening. "In 2 years, my contract ends. You'll no longer be legally bound now, while I'm still technically your employee, so that everyone knows it's not about the debt being paid or the contract ending. Marry me so they understand I'm choosing you just as clearly as you chose me on that auction platform. Marry me because I love you and want to build the rest of my life with you as my wife, my partner, my equal in every way that matters." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. Happiness and relief and love so intense it hurt. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you, John Hawk. I love your strength and your gentleness, your past and the future we're building. I love that you're wild and free and choose to be here with me anyway. Yes, absolutely yes." They held each other on that hilltop, two people who had found in each other something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. They married a month later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, attended by the few friends Eleanor had retained and several of the ranchers who had come to respect John Hawk's expertise. The marshal stood as witness, and the local minister, after significant convincing and a reminder about grace and redemption, performed the ceremony. The remaining years of John Hawk's contract passed, but the designation became meaningless. He worked not as a laborer, but as a husband and partner, and when the official end date arrived, they celebrated quietly, marking it as a formality rather than a transformation. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts becoming known throughout the territory for quality livestock and honest dealing. They never quite achieved total acceptance in Redemption Springs. There would always be those who remembered and judged, but they built their own community, their own family of sorts, from the misfits and outsiders who gravitated to people who understood being judged for circumstances rather than character. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant at 42, a late and unexpected blessing that terrified and delighted them both. Their daughter was born healthy and strong, inheriting her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. Years later, sitting on that same porch where they had first acknowledged their feelings, watching their daughter play in the yard, John Hawk turned to Eleanor with a contemplative expression. "Do you ever regret it? Spending that $600 on a stranger? Enduring the judgment, the struggle, the complications?" Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Looking out at the thriving ranch, the life they had built, the family they had created. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "That was the best $600 I ever spent. You know what I regret?" She turned to meet his eyes. "I regret that auction existed at all. I regret that you suffered what you suffered to end up there. But I will never regret finding you, choosing you, loving you. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, John Hawk. Then, now, and forever." John Hawk pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "They laughed at my scars that day," he said quietly. "You promised to kiss everyone. You kept that promise, Eleanor. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. You honored every broken part of me until I felt whole again. That's a debt I can never repay, but I'll spend my life trying." Eleanor turned in his arms, cupping his face with both hands. "You've already repaid it 1,000 times over. By staying, by choosing me every single day, by building this life with me. We saved each other, my love." That's what happened on that platform 4 years ago. Two people who needed saving found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. They kissed, soft and sweet, a celebration of survival and choice and love that had transformed them both. The sun set on another day at the ranch, painting the sky in the spectacular colors that made the frontier beautiful despite its harshness. Inside, the lamp burned warm and welcoming. The woman who had once stood alone on an auction platform had found her partner, her equal, her love. The man who had stood in chains, believing his life was over, had found home, purpose, and a reason to embrace rather than merely endure existence. They had bridged worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile, brutal and delicate, savage and civilized, imprisoned and free, and in bridging them had created something entirely their own. The Whitmore Ranch stood as testament to what could be built when courage met compassion, when two people chose to see past scars to the souls beneath, when love was given a chance to flourish in even the most unlikely soil. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.